Now the prayer of Nehemiah is heard. Welcome to another tidbit from the books of Esther and Nehemiah, books that we are studying this particular quarter. We have come to chapter 2 in the book of Nehemiah. The latter part of the first chapter is a prayer by Nehemiah, and his specific petition is that God will grant him mercy by this man. And this man now turns out to be the king of the Persian Empire, King Artaxerxes. In chapter 2, it is said that in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, that is an idiomatic expression of an official party, I took the wine and gave it to the king. That was the job of Nehemiah, to be in charge of the food and be careful that the right food was offered to the king. And then he adds, I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of the heart. And now comes a very interesting little expression. I was very much afraid. Why would Nehemiah be afraid? And the point is actually that when you are in the king's presence, you are not to exhume feelings of negativity, nervousness. And the king would be then reacting, maybe there's a plot on my life. So Nehemiah has all reason to be afraid that his sadness has been spotted. Now, Nehemiah is a wise man. His reply to the king is very polite, and the conversation and negotiations between the king and Nehemiah, which is the fulfillment of his prayer from chapter 1, his conversations will occupy this chapter until verse 8 and 9. Now, he begins by saying, may the king live forever. That is a customary, polite greeting that we will find in the biblical books that everyone had when they approached a king. Also in Daniel that is the case, except that in the book of Daniel, as long as the kings are kings who aspire to live forever, or aspire to establish kingdoms that will never be removed, Daniel and his friends are not polite. Only when King Darius has acknowledged the eternal kingdom of God, Daniel can address him by, may the king live forever. But back to Nehemiah and his negotiations with the king. The king, of course, listens to Nehemiah's reply, why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins? Nehemiah is wise. He does not primarily emphasize the political aspect, but the more personal aspect. The king would be able to understand the sadness in the heart of Nehemiah when hearing that that is where his fathers, his ancestors' tombs are. That would be a common concern for all people within that culture. So the king asked him, what is it you want? And before Nehemiah answers him, he prays. Then I prayed to the God of heaven. So in all secret, while he's standing in front of the king, but with his eyes open, his mind would go up to the King of heaven in prayer. And then, having asked God to help, he would ask the king, if it pleases your king, if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city of Judah where my ancestors are buried so I can rebuild it. Now, we probably should imagine that these conversations, as listed, took place over time in different occasions, and this is a summary. Because in the next scene, it said, then the king with the queen sitting beside him asked me, Normally the queen would not be part of the official gathering that was mentioned before, so this could be a more private, intimate setting. He asked, how long will your journey take? Now, first he's granted the permission. Then he has to figure out when it is a convenient time. How long time will he be away? The king has to ask his administrators, what effect will that have for the job? Who will take over while Nehemiah is gone? How long should his furlough last? All that would be part of the background. It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. And then in verse 7 and onwards, Nehemiah is asking also for official documents which could authorize him to do several things. Among them, to have a letter to the keeper of the royal park. We don't know where that is, but most likely there were far more parks, far more forest in ancient Palestine and Israel than there is today. Most likely the king had taken occupation, some part of it, in order to make sure that he had what he needed for building projects. In this case, Nehemiah needs it for building of his family house and the walls, of course, of Jerusalem. The word park, by the way, is a Persian loanword, pardes in Hebrew. That's the word from which we have paradise. Paradise was a place where there was a park, a garden, an enclosed space of peace, of flowers and trees and watering. Now, the remainder of the chapter deals with Nehemiah's quick travel, quick in the sense that there are no details about his travel, not much as you would have when Ezra's travel in Ezra 8 is described, his travel back from Mesopotamia. But Nehemiah chapter 4 is about this trip back and his first inspection of the situation and his meeting with the enemies. The latter part of the chapter is actually framed by a reference to the enemies. Let's read. In verse 10, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. And in verse 19, this section closes with a similar phrasing. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and then you have added another enemy, Geshem the Arab, heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed. Now, these three enemies are actually historically known figures. Sanballat, or Sin Ubalit, is a Babylonian name. May Sin, that's the name of the moon god, may Sin give life. He was the governor of Samaria, at least at a later stage when he was an elderly gentleman. He's mentioned in one of the letters from the island of Elephantine down on the Nile in Egypt, and is still a governor in 408 before Christ. Then you have Tobiah the Ammonite. The Tobiahite family is well known in subsequent centuries as an important, influential, leading governmental family in the province of Ammon, east of the River Jordan. Now, the last one which is mentioned in the second bearing is Geshem the Arab. And we have several sources for Geshem. He's mentioned on an inscription in Dedan, and he's also mentioned on a silver vessel found down in Egypt. His title back then would have been Geshem, King of Kedar. So these people are not just accidental persons. These are three of the most influential leaders who had many peoples that they could send around and order and command around as they wanted to. And now they are mocking him, that is, ridiculing Nehemiah. What is it you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king? And of course, they knew, Nehemiah knew, that he had the authorization from the king. So his answer is not to go into details about that authorization, but simply to state the positive, which is the closing of the chapter, verse 20. The God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. So, in a sense, Nehemiah ends where he began. He referred to his fathers, his ancestors' tombs in Jerusalem. He had a past. He wanted to have a future in Jerusalem. These enemies had neither. They had no past in Jerusalem, and they will have no future in the city of God. Thank you for listening to this tidbit from Nehemiah 3 and 4. I'm Dr. Peterson, and I'll welcome you back as we continue our study of Nehemiah and Ezra.